Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Viviana Zelizer, the Lloyd Kotzen Professor of Sociology at Princeton University. Her most recent book is The Purchase of Intimacy from Princeton University Press, a look at money and relationships and how they conflict and complement each other. Viviana, welcome to EconTalk.
I'm delighted to be here.
Viviana, our culture has areas where the use of money in relationships is totally encouraged and taken for granted. So if I go to the grocery and I pay money and the grocer gives me some food, whether it's a chain or my local corner grocer, we all understand that relationship is a monetary relationship. There's no discomfort there, and I may have a friendly relationship with that grocer, but the fact that there's money involved, we don't think twice about it. But let's take another case where food is involved, and let's suppose my wife's just had a baby and a neighbor brings over a meal as a way to help us get through this challenge of having a newborn in the house, and I offer to pay for it. Now, in that situation, and which I would be horrified to do, my neighbor would be horrified, in that situation, money is somehow out of bounds. Our culture would frown on the use of money in that setting, and we treat those relationships very differently, even though they're both about food. And react to that example.
Oh, no, that's a wonderful example of the sort of differentiation that Purchase of Intimacy tries to make. The first question is, why does that difference exist, and why do we feel so uncomfortable with the money payment to an intimate, any kind of intimate relationship, in this case, a neighbor or a friendly neighbor? And the whole point of the book is to explore this division, this idea that intimacy has to be, that in fact that the world divides into two quite separate spheres, and one that is intimate, that is emotional, that is intuitive, and the other that is rational, that is calculating, that is impersonal. And the assumption is that mix the two and each will corrupt the other. And the book is trying to show in what ways this kind of reasoning is misguided. Now, the example that you made of the purchase of food from a regular provider, usually it will be, kind of spot purchases or even sporadic purchases. But you could imagine friendships developing even with service providers of some kind that that they might eventually do a discount, or that you might want to at the end of the year give a gift to that person, and you will be introducing some kind of economic transaction into that relationship that is apparently much less intimate, to differentiate it, though, from more instantaneous spot-like market transactions. So that what is interesting is not just the division between intimacy and non-intimacy that we make, but we also, within those markets, in the very example that you gave, we would start making differentiations.
Well, I like the point, which comes through very often in the book, about the blurring that you talk about. As scholars, we don't like blurring in general. Yeah. We like clean
dichotomies.
Yeah, we like models that have stark predictions, not maybe predictions.
Yeah.
But in the case of the grocer, a lot of people, I think, pay a premium to shop at a smaller provider rather than a big box store because they like having that relationship that you're talking about. And over time, that relationship does get blurred. And it's true, there's a self-interest involved. Obviously, the more closely you relate to the grocer or the person at the corner store, the more likely they'll do you a favor. They'll order something special for you. They'll let you pay later, come back later with the money. They might deliver when they don't usually deliver, but because you're a longtime customer. We all understand that there is a self-interested aspect, but there's clearly a non-self-interested aspect. The people enjoy having a different, purely non-commercial relationship in such a setting, and people enjoy having pleasant friendships in some degree with the people we do business with. It's a huge part of our life. Why wouldn't we want those friendships there?
Exactly. Yeah. Okay. But let me just add. But the interesting thing is that I had not thought of this example until you brought it up. That you might use an economic transaction, and I define gifts as also economic transactions. You might use a gift to purchase a gift that you would give, a small thing maybe that you would give one of these relationships to say, well, you're special.
Sure. Different than you would with the tip.
Exactly. Well, exactly. The tip brings us into a very different set of questions.
Well, I want you to expand on this notion that you mentioned a minute ago, which you talked about separate spheres. You talked about how we're encouraged to keep these separate out of fear that something they might damage one another. And in the book, you talk about this also as a hostile worlds, that these two types of transactions, the intimacy and the commercial, are often viewed as hostile to each other. Talk about first explain the sort of standard view that you're critiquing, and then give us your critique.
Okay, no. The standard assumption is that there are two. The first step is that there are separate spheres, right? That there is the sphere, as I said, of economics, of rational calculation, and then there is a very separate sphere of intimacy, close ties, etc. So the first step is the assumption of separate spheres. And then the second step is what I call hostile worlds, that if the spheres mix with each other, there will be contamination in both spheres. Now, what is very interesting is that it works both ways. So that, let's say, for the first, the contamination of intimacy by mixing it with economics, think of concerns with prenuptial agreements, or the worry about loaning money to friends, or of workplace romances, right?
Sure.
I mean, those are general. What I wanted to distinguish that the concern with mixing economic activity in the warm world of friendship, etc., that will turn those relationships, whether it's friendship, marriage, parent-child, they will turn into a calculating market as soon as you have some kind of intrusion of money or economic calculation. But what is interesting is that it also works in the opposite direction, so that people worry, that if workers get too chummy on the job, they will spend more time with each other than with their work. That intimacy, the other direction or the other concern in the hostile world's worries is that intimacy will interfere with efficiency. So that, in a way, people want mixed intimate relations with economic activity in either direction at your own peril. And in fact, I am now writing a paper that looks at the second worry. The purchase of intimacy mostly looks at the concern and how really the mixture of or the intrusion of economic activity in intimate relations, what happens then. Now I'm actually looking, more briefly at what happens and why are people so worried about intimate relations in the workplace, ranging from the regulation of dating to the concerns with nepotism, to family business, etc. So those are the concerns. Now, the book really challenges all these taboos, right? Showing that the world does not divide into two segregated spheres of intimacy and economics, and that all of us routinely mix our most intimate relations with economic activities. That, in fact, we owe economic support to our children, to our spouses, to our parents, to our friends, that the separation is a myth, and in fact, that no loving household could survive without economic activity.
And it's a very interesting thesis. One of the things I want to challenge you on that is to hear you talk about the distinction between what in economics is called the positive and the normative. So the positive side of this in economics, that's a formal term, not meaning optimistic or cheerful. Positive meaning how the world is, and normative being how it ought to be. I think most people would say you're right on the positive sense that we do constantly mix in various ways our economic, I'm going to say our financial monetary transactions.
It's not just monetary transactions. It's household work. It's a lot of other economic activities.
Okay, exchange.
And not just money.
Okay, exchange in various ways. So we do blur those distinctions. We do have intimate relationships, parent, child, husband, wife, doctor, patient, and examples you give in the book where money inevitably does play a role. That's the positive side. But the normative side is how we want it to be. And as a scholar, as an economist, I'm very much in agreement with you that we should treat that blurring as a piece of reality. That's the way the world is. Now, let's talk about the normative side, though. Mm-hmm. Is it a good thing? Should it be encouraged or discouraged? And why do we have such emotional reactions to these examples? Let me give you a quote I once heard from someone who got a job working for a very wealthy, well-endowed foundation that gives out a lot of money. So he got a job as an executive in this foundation, and he told me that a friend, after he got this job, a friend told him, "Well, you're never going to get a bad meal or an honest compliment for the rest of your life." Meaning you're going to eat well because you're going to be going to a lot of fancy dinners, and because you hand out money, you're not going to get an honest compliment. You're going to get a lot of compliments. They won't be very honest because people are going to be trying to get access to the foundation that you are involved in. And we don't like that idea, right? We don't like the idea that friendship is purchased, even though we understand that these exchanges take place in friendship, that there are incentives for people to behave in certain ways. But do you think that's a good thing?
Okay, this is a very central question. In fact, it has two parts. Because let me start with the first part. If in fact the world behaves as I'm saying, if in fact, we are mixing these things, and I think that's, as you say, the positive description is exactly that this is what happens. The question would be not just is it good or bad, but first why? Why are people so worried, and why do people think in hostile world terms? If in fact they're mixing, right? Why is this ideology so powerful? It's not like everybody else is silly and I discovered the truth, right?
Correct.
I am aware, and in fact this I will say that it's only when I was ending the book that I realized, well, I really have to, think a little harder about this issue, since it's something that comes out with my students, saying, but really, and then why do we feel so strongly about this? And what I argue is that, we use hostile worlds as a kind of magic spell or a story to keep away the evils of the wrong relationship. Like, I'm your date, not some, paid person. I'm not, or in the case, I'm not just a nanny, let's say. I'm not just a hired maid. I'm like a mother to your kid. Or you're not my lover, you're my lawyer. So that you're trying to say, well, we're constantly trying to establish, what kinds of relationships we have with people. And one of the ways that we make that separation is by saying, well, we're not like into money things. We're better. And by making that effort that we make, in fact, blinds us to the actual economic exchanges that are going on. Let's say you're trying to differentiate, a date from a paid relationship of intimacy or even an engaged, who's paying for the date. The point is that we're uncomfortable with money, and yet the transaction is going on.
Absolutely.
And the nanny is getting a wage that recognizes her work.
She's not working for you because she loves you. She's not working for you because your children are so special.
Exactly.
Although they may be. And she may like you even, but
absolutely, that, and we may want to talk more because I think that the issue of paid care is becoming both academically and policy-wise one of a crucial issue, and we can talk about that more. But in any case, so that we could say that we deploy the separate spheres ideology to manage the kind of threat of our good relationships seeming too much like bad ones. So one way of differentiating is, well, I'm not like, it's not like a money thing.
Right. We have a certain romance about ourselves, our identity in some of those situations.
Okay, but that doesn't answer your question is, do we worry about, money, should we worry about this monetization? And or concern or entering of economic calculation? Well, my answer would be, I wouldn't worry whether, let's go with money. I wouldn't worry whether money is intruding in a relationship. I would be worrying about what kinds of mixtures are occurring, whether there are mixtures that are demeaning, mixtures that are exploitative. So and in fact, and that again, the issue of paid care raises this very poignantly. My argument is once you stop worrying so much about mixing intimacy with economic activity, we can work towards right mixes. What is the kind of right? This person who rightly so would be worried that their friends, that people would approach him just because, he has money to give, and that's a particular also consequence of certain kinds of jobs that will have money attached to them in different ways. But in any case, the issue is, well, he may worry about that relationship because it would be exploitative, etc. But it doesn't mean that he won't have other kinds of monetary relationships with friends, family, and co-workers, which are not corrupting. You see, so the issue is not, do we worry generally about the intrusion of money, which is the standard trope of social thinkers, forever, and instead say, well, which kinds of mixtures are, again, unfair, exploitative, and those we don't want. I mean, and I'll just do one more thing, and the book or my argument should not be seen as saying, the market and economic transactions are wonderful always, and people who worry about it are silly. People who worry are, of course, are trying to kind of protect us in some way, but the point is that they get the causal connections wrong. That is, they assume, money enters, consequence, values, and intimacy fly away. And what I'm saying is, no, it doesn't always work that way. And once we get those wrong assumptions out of the way, we can start asking the interesting questions, which are, well, when is it corrupting? And let's fix it. Or when is it enhancing? You help your children pay your kids through college, or as most, many households give money for the first house or mortgage. Those kinds of economic arrangements are an intrusion, you could say, in quotation marks, of money, and yet they are enhancing relationships, not damaging them. I'm sorry, this was long, but this is you raised a question that goes to the heart of this book.
Well, let me an example just came to mind, and then I want to switch gears a little bit. The example that came to mind, talking about some of these relationships are good, some are not so good. A lot of athletes, I've never noticed this until just now, but a lot of athletes will talk about how once they become successful, they become professional athletes and they get enormously wealthy. They're very proud of saying, but I haven't changed. That money hasn't ruined me. It hasn't changed me. And often, the example that the story will talk about on these, when it profiles someone like this, is when the athlete returns to his hometown, he still hangs out with his old buddies, the people who were his friends when he was nobody. But of course, those are the friends that he knows are truly his friends because they were his friends before he was somebody. Once he's somebody and has a lot of money, he has to be more wary and is less sure of who is his real friend. And in that sense, it's perhaps not surprising that so many athletes are still good friends with the people that they grew up with. I never thought about that example. I don't know if that fits in with your view of the world.
I think you raise, it's very interesting because I have two other parallel examples to the one you raised. One is lottery winners. One of the first things that I've never done this systematically, but I've always been intrigued. One of the first things that big time lottery winners will say, well, I'm going to keep my old friends. I'm going to be the same.
Right.
Or if they ask them, what do you plan to buy? You have suddenly $4 million. And I've heard, I was actually once on a television interview, and before me was a lottery winner, and again, like $4 million, and what are you going to buy? Well, a better lawnmower.
There you go. Yeah.
To show the normalcy, and that will keep neighborly relationships. And the other example, you'll see there's different spheres, but I think that different. Well, I don't want to use spheres, but different locations. But raising your same question is with child actors. When parents are interviewed, again, these kids that earn millions of dollars, and the one of the ways in which the parents will convey to the press the kind of normalization of the childhood is again saying, well, we keep them with their regular friends, or we give there was a very interesting interview with when Brooke Shields was just a kid, and I kept that interview. The mother was asked about precisely, how has her life changed, etc. She said, no, she's just like a regular kid. I give her an allowance.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Just like a regular kid.
Exactly. She was earning $1 million a month, and, the $5 allowance. But the point is the point that you're making, well, not, you're making different points in your example. But one of the points is first is that the type of that huge changes in economic location, in a way, kind of get normalized by maintaining earlier relationships, thus kind of protecting against exploitation, or also that certain kinds of economic activities convey the meaning of normalcy.
Yeah, no, that's a nice point.
But I mean, I think that the example of the sports, the very high-paced sports people, it makes that point, I think, very nicely. And they're differentiating relationships. And again, when they go back, for example, with their childhood friends, it's not that money is not going to be involved. They probably will be treating,
Sure.
They go out to a bar, they will be treating maybe everybody for a beer.
Right.
But or not. Or they may be, in fact, you see, they may use, and again, this is where how relationships really shape the economic activity. They may treat everybody to convey certain kind of relationship, or they may, in fact, be, quote, cheap and not pay to kind of test what kind of relationship,
Sure.
whether the others will buy.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Let me give you another example that your point brings to mind about what the real question is: what kind of relationships do we want, and make sure they're not distasteful. One issue that's come up in a number of previous podcasts in this series is the issue of organ donation and whether we should have a market for kidneys, whether, say, kidneys and other body parts should be bought and sold. There's a whole bunch of areas like this. You mentioned a number of them in the book. We could talk about adoption. These are issues that have enormous emotional baggage for most people, and they're very uncomfortable with the suggestion that people should be able to buy and sell babies or body parts or all kinds of things that we have this emotional baggage about. And most economists, many economists, I don't know if it's most, but many economists, being less worried about this, want to see a market for kidneys. They want to allow people to buy and sell kidneys because they think it would have an enormous impact on the supply, and that fewer people would die who are currently on dialysis. And the counterpoint often is, well, but see, that's going to introduce money into this. That's going to have all these other incentive effects, which are often true. There will be other effects. But your point, and I'm going to put words in your mouth and let you agree or disagree.
Yeah.
Your point might be, well, medicine's a pretty financially freighted activity already. I mean, to argue that a poor person shouldn't be allowed to make $10,000 off a kidney because their judgment will be clouded and they might donate a kidney and not realize the risks, while the doctor who is putting the kidney in is making $500,000 a year from the kidney that was properly done through this clean, non-monetary method. The doctor's not a volunteer. The doctor's in the middle of a financial transaction, and the whole thing is a certain romance that's an illusion.
Yeah. Okay. Now that's again something that I've been concerned and about that topic. One of my former students here at Princeton, who now is a professor, teaches sociology at Arizona, Kieran Healy, a book just came out by Chicago Press called Last Best Gifts. And this was his dissertation, now turned into a book, and it is a study of the economy of blood and organ transfers. Mm-hmm. And plus there's another a wonderful paper that is forthcoming by a UCLA graduate student whose dissertation is comparing the egg donors and sperm donors, the economy of those two, which are very different.
Similar set of emotional, financial issues, though.
Okay, so absolutely. So this is a let's take the case of the organ shortage, which is so dramatic, and whether or not we should turn that into a regular market in order to have a greater supply. And there, one of the anticipating, I don't know if we want to discuss that later, but anticipating one of the other arguments that I critique in the book, which is what I call the nothing but economics.
Yeah, explain that, the nothing but. It's a little hard to hear. It's easier to read on the page and to the ear.
Let me try, right?
So
I call it, let's say if I call it nothing but economics, but we can also call it the market argument. The pure market argument, in which, what's that argument? It says that people who worry about mixing economics and intimacy are really misguided, but not because of all these reasons that I gave, but simply because intimacy, be it the sale of children or, or the sale of the provision of an organ, ultimately, if you look close enough, they work very similarly to other kinds of non-intimate markets like the sale of cars or of plasma televisions, that ultimately all transactions, all economic transactions can be reduced to one explanatory model, which is a cost benefit, and if you look hard enough, that's what you will find.
Maximizing under constraints,
exactly.
Where prices emerge, whether they are monetary or non-monetary prices, and I will quote one of my old professors, George Stigler, just to get your blood going. He used to say, there is only one social science, and we are its practitioners, meaning it's the ultimate nothing but. Everything is nothing but economics. It's all about exchange. It's all about self-interest. It's all about rationality. And that's a viewpoint I'm sympathetic to, but it's not the whole story, and I know you don't think so go ahead.
Exactly. So, and of course the hero the courageous, most courageous adventurer in that field is Gary Becker, because in fact he took over the work of sociologists quite explicitly by saying that the economic model could explain all these things that sociologists had been trying to explain, from marriage onto all kinds of other issues. Now, let me say two positive things about that model. The first one, that at least, unlike the hostile world, it recognizes that activities like household exchanges or organ exchanges have an economic component, right? The kind of recognition that a hostile worlder won't make. They will say, no, it has nothing to do with economics. So that's a plus. And second, even more specifically, when it comes to Gary Becker and the study of household economies, as some feminist economists have actually acknowledged, we do owe him a debt, because until Gary Becker, economists didn't think that households were at all sites of economic activity. So just even though his actual Venn analysis is problematic, the fact that he recognized it as a site of economic activity deserves, praise.
No,
okay.
Clearly created a tremendously innovative literature within economics, and of course it's spilled over into other fields.
Exactly. Now, but ultimately, he's wrong, and from my perspective, he's wrong because it doesn't recognize the fact that underpinning any kind of markets are different kinds of social relations that people have. Different markets have different meanings, so that a single market model saying everything can be reduced to this market has to be blind to the reality that there are multiple markets, each composed by different kinds of social relations and different kinds of meaning systems of value, so that the market for babies, has economic components, but it's not the same as a corporate market or a market for cars, because the social relations of parenthood, the meaning of children, which I, wrote a book on the meaning of children, etc., are not reducible or certainly not identical to the kinds of economic relations and meanings that are involved in the sale of electronics components, for example. And if we don't understand what are the underlying differences, then we can't really explain or predict properly.
Well, that's an interesting argument, and let me give you a counterpoint and get your reaction. Certainly true that the market for babies and the market for cars are different, as you point out. There are obvious things that are different about them: emotional issues, cultural issues, certainly biological issues that affect us in all kinds of complex ways. But I think one thing that Gary Becker would respond, one thing I'd respond is, oh, that's true, but supply and demand still work. That is, if you get an increase in the demand for adoption or an increase in the demand for kidneys, these products that are not like potatoes, it's still going to be the case that the price is going to rise. It may not be the monetary price, it may not be the legal price, but there will be certain behavior that we can predict will happen as a result. Do you agree with that, or do you think that's just...
Well, I think at some level I agree, but I would also say that gives me so little information, and it's so general, that I won't understand how markets work by that general proposition. And to be specific, I would not be able to explain why in the late 20th century in the United States, poor mothers that could not support their babies had to put them in what were called baby farms, so that they paid women and they put them in these homes where they probably would die, but they had to pay to get rid of a baby. And by 1920s or so, you have a booming market you have a beginning of a booming market for those babies, in which people start paying huge sums of money to get those babies. And it's not just any baby. It was, certain kinds of babies, mostly blue-eyed, blonde, curly-haired little, as soon as they had hair, babies.
Yeah.
I would not understand what's going on simply by that general principle, because I would not understand how the market works, why certain kinds of children, when and how do kids enter market, which kids. My explanation would be so light that it wouldn't really amount to much.
Well, I think that's a criticism that can be made of economics generally. We also don't have a very good idea of why certain colors of cars come into fashion. There are fads in that. We probably have more to say about adoption preferences relying on biology than we do about car preferences. But it's an interesting question. It's a very
and not all economics. I mean, one of the fascinating, one of the wonderful things that is happening is to note the changes in the world, in the study of economics.
Absolutely.
And I think that momentous changes, slow but momentous changes, are happening right now that allow a dialogue between economics and sociology, which was really actually there's changes both in sociology and economics that make at least the possibility of a dialogue that was completely hushed for years.
Yeah, economics is a much less sterile field than it was 40 years ago.
Yes.
It's a much more interesting
place
to live.
Just the development of behavioral economics, of game theory, that immediately introduces all kinds of elements that open up the possibility of dialogue.
Yeah, and we've had some podcasts along those lines. Let me go back to your hostile worlds world for a minute, and I want to give you a quote from Friedrich Hayek, which is a very dramatic statement about hostile worlds. And I want let's talk about it. So here's the quote. It comes from The Fatal Conceit. And what Hayek was arguing is that family life and market life require us to be schizophrenic. Very much the hostile worlds idea. And one of the things I loved about your book, and the thing it's so provocative, it really forces you to think about these issues, whether you're a sociologist or an economist. It's such a fertile and interesting set of ideas. Thank
you for that.
Here's what Hayek said.
Yes.
Part of our present difficulty is that we must constantly adjust our lives, our thoughts, and our emotions in order to live simultaneously within different kinds of orders according to different rules. If we were to apply the unmodified, uncurbed rules of the microcosmos, i.e. of the small band or troop, or of, say, our families, to the macrocosmos, our wider civilization, as our instincts and sentimental yearnings often make us wish to do, we would destroy it. Yet, if we were always to apply the rules of the extended order to our more intimate groupings, we would crush them. So we must learn to live in two sorts of worlds at once. And what Hayek there, as you pointed out a few minutes ago, and that's what I want to come back to, Hayek's saying that if we run our families like businesses, they won't be very pleasant. Most people have that either it's a prejudice or a belief or a desire to avoid that. But it's the other direction I want to come back to that you pointed out is also there in the hostile worlds hypothesis, which is what Hayek is saying is, just as it's a mistake to try to run a family as if it were a business, it's a mistake to run a business as if it were a family, or even at a larger sense, it's a mistake to run a nation as if it were a family. And so one of the implications of this is that socialism, which was one of Hayek's big issues, is not going to be a good thing. It's going to be anti-civilization. But you might apply it, as I've thought about, to corporate responsibility. This desire that we have to have corporations run in a more loving way. And what Hayek is suggesting is that that's a mistake. So give me your perspective on that.
Well, what a great quote. I did not know that quote.
Yeah, it's awesome, isn't it? Yeah.
It perfectly summarizes what I'm critiquing.
I'll give you the page number via email.
Terrific. No, terrific, because this is, you obviously captured what I was trying to criticize. Well, there's several issues here, but because the issue, first the concern which I raised earlier in our conversation, that organizational efficiency is threatened by any kind of intimacy within the organization, which is in fact a growing concern in American corporations. There is a very interesting paper by a Yale law professor, Vicky Schultz, that talks about the sanitization of the workplace, right?
Sanitization?
The sanitization of the workplace. And in fact, as I said, I'm writing, there's some of this in Purchase of Intimacy very briefly, and I'm expanding on it now. But there's some evidence also that there's greater regulation, for example, of dating relationships. You probably remember the Stone Cipher debacle. Why did he have to quit? Because they discovered that he was having a relationship with a coworker. And, about 2 years ago, they discovered some racy emails at Stone Cipher, and he had to leave. But why did he have to leave? Because that kind of relationship brought embarrassment to the organization, right?
Sure.
And there are now all kinds of what are called Cupid contracts and love contracts to try to regulate that. But it's not. And by the way, the concern is not just with this kind of intimate love relationship, but even with friendships. You know, the concern is that friendships will threaten the organization, collusion, all kinds of things. And again, the evidence on that is not very strong. You know, it goes both sides. You know, sometimes yes, but again, it's another place that you have to ask, well then, how come family firms are one of the strongest organizational business forms in the United States? And family firms, you know, certainly are mixing intimate relations and other kinds of forms of valuation than pure efficiency.
Well, that's an interesting question, and there have probably been studies on it that I'm not aware of.
Not much.
Well, there should be, because we all have anecdotal evidence of family firms that work beautifully and those that destroy families, right?
Absolutely.
So it's a very interesting area.
No, but there is evidence that family firms, in fact, are very effective, too.
Oh, of course, yeah.
Economically effective.
No, that's why I say it's anecdotal. I think we know some horror stories on the negative side. The positive side is very powerful. It's obviously one way to deal with capital market incompleteness, especially for immigrants who come here with, they obviously are families and community relationships are very, very important in economic success.
No, but you did raise the issue. I did not forget that you raised the issue of corporate responsibility. We actually did not go into. I mean, I was also, we had a leftover on the organ market.
Yeah.
But let's leave this book on last best gifts, which really answers those things very, very nicely.
Okay, we'll put a link up to it on the website.
That would be because it. You know, I think your listeners who are interested in the topic will find that very interesting. In any case, the issue of course, it's not an issue that I have studied a little bit. I have studied in some research I've done on ethics and economic sociology. So I have looked at corporate codes of conduct and that kind of thing. But the more general issue of corporate responsibility, there is again a big debate in whether, and you probably is what you're referring, a debate whether in fact corporations, by taking on kind of moral responsibilities, are being irresponsible to the stockholders, right? And then there's some group that actually try to argue that in fact those acts of virtuous behavior are efficient because for many, they're broadcasting some aspects of the organization that make increase their profits, right?
Sure.
So whether in that case, that's a little bit less directly explainable by the purchase of intimacy, but again, there I would argue that certainly the acts of corporate, the mixture of responsible moral concerns, one should not assume that will necessarily mean the elimination of efficiency. And again, I think that there's empirical evidence on both sides. But the fact is that I think that it's a growing trend.
Well, let me think of it a different way, which comes partly from reading your book. I find it, again, very stimulating. You referred to a work that worries about the sanitization, the sterilization of the workplace.
Yeah.
This obsessive worry about the role of friendship or sexuality or other issues, and therefore the workplace becomes a much less interesting and perhaps less productive place if we become overly concerned about these issues.
Yes.
Let me try to get at it a different way. When I talk about a firm being run like a family, many successful firms do introduce the intimacy that you're talking about here, not quite in the way we've been referring to it so far, but in a different way. Let me try to explain. If in the old days, and it may still be true, if you worked for Southwest Airlines, you had a lot of loyalty to the organization. And they explicitly, as do many corporations, they explicitly try to create that loyalty, that feeling of community, which is both self-interested, because it makes often for a more effective workplace, and it's also more pleasant because it's part of our lives. We spend a large part of our lives in our workplaces. Why shouldn't they be more communal, more pleasant, more friendly, et cetera? So Southwest Airlines in the old days, and again, I think it's still somewhat true, really worked hard to create a tremendous amount of camaraderie among their employees and a lot of affection. The examples that are very powerful are the CEO, Herb Kelleher at the time, would go down to the baggage claim area on Thanksgiving or Christmas and would work alongside the baggage claim workers shuffling luggage around. Now, obviously, that was good PR, although he never promoted it. It was good for the organization, though, and it obviously meant something to those folks. And if you asked other CEOs why they wouldn't do that also, I think they'd say, because I couldn't fake it. I think Herb actually did enjoy going down to the baggage claim and working. There was a story, I don't know if it's true, I read it in a book about Southwest Airlines. There was a story that when they would recruit workers, they'd put a bunch of job applicants in a room, and they'd tell them, well, one of the things we want you to do is we want you to write a 5-minute presentation, and each of you will get up front of the room here, stand up, and present why you're right for the job or something about yourself. So everybody starts scribbling furiously, and then after a few minutes, they invite people up to make their presentations. And supposedly what Southwest would do is that instead of watching the person making the presentation, the Southwest people would watch the people in the audience. How many of them would be scribbling away, working on their own presentation instead of listening, versus the people who'd be empathetic and smiling and trying to encourage this poor person who's standing up on short notice to make a presentation, who might be shy, and they would hire the people who are empathetic, not the people who are the good presenters. That had no value whatsoever. The whole thing was a charade to try to select on the basis of empathy. So that's a really beautiful example.
Oh, absolutely.
I don't know if it's true, and I don't know if it's important, but the point I want to make is that in a lot of American corporations, there is this perhaps fake, perhaps real mixing of intimacy and or what we might call emotion and the economic. And it's very effective. It clearly is better to have an organization where the people care about the organization and not just themselves. And yet I think Hayek is right in the sense that to extend that beyond an organization to society at large is very dangerous. So I think that your point, which you can agree or disagree with, would be, well, yes, some of these are good, some are not good, and you have to look at a case-by-case basis.
Look, it's a great example that you give. Now, there's many things that are interesting, but one of is the comparison between top-down construction of intimacy by the corporation and which kinds of intimacy does the top consider contributes to organizational efficiency. So you gave one example, for example, also the growing institution of mentoring, right? You're encouraging a kind of intimate relationship between the mentor and the mentoree.
Absolutely.
And you do Christmas parties, so there's certain kinds of top-down corporate-initiated intimacies that belong to one category, right? And then the question there becomes, well, many people would say is fake, and I would agree that, it's not necessarily, in some cases, yes, it's probably PR, it's probably an artificial use of the concept of family in a setting that is not a family to manipulate relationships, but, there can be also some, authentic, and then we would have to get into what do we mean by authentic. So top-down is one category, but then then the other, the ones that firms are more concerned with are the bottom-up ones, the friendships and the types of personal connections that grow up spontaneously and that may not necessarily contribute to organizational efficiency. What we're beginning to realize, and it's not, just my research, but research by other economic sociologists within different kinds of organizations, when the extent to which many of these, buddy system arrangements of friendships do contribute to organizational efficiency. So I would say to Hayek, worry a bit, but don't worry so, as you predicted, I would say, in such a generalized, undistinguished way, because you won't understand what is going on. And then you can set up an empirical agenda to try to study, and you can do that, in what ways do intimate relations in these organizations contribute or threaten organizational efficiency. There's interesting work being done by some MIT sociologists, for example, on the referral system in certain organizations. When people within the organization refer friends or acquaintances, and what's the effect of having those people in the organization? It seems pretty good.
Yeah. Well, I think Hayek would find no problem with organizations that choose whatever methods they think work best, knowing that in organizations that are run well will attract people, and those that won't will struggle. And I think his bigger concern was our desire to push that intimacy to society at large. But it's a very interesting area. Well, we're almost out of time.
Yes.
Do you have 5 or 10 more minutes, Viviana? Because I wanted to read you one more quote.
Oh, yes, let's do that.
Okay, because it's on paid care, and I think you'll give you a chance to close out with that.
Yes.
Okay.
It's a very important area.
Okay.
Yes.
Let me read you an excerpt from an article in the San Francisco Chronicle that is a nice example, I think, of this issue of the blurring that we've been talking about for most of this podcast. Here's the quote. These days, it's possible to outsource nearly every part of parenting, except maybe the hugs, as a burgeoning industry springs up in the Bay Area and major cities around the country to help busy, well-financed moms and dads who lack either the time or the self-confidence to do what past generations of parents did by themselves. This new growth industry also includes potty trainers, party planners who specialize in the under 10 set, and lice removal experts. Yes, Bay Area parents can even hire someone to come to their house and pick the nits out of their loved one's locks. So, some economists would say, that's comparative advantage. That's what economics is all about, specialization, and that's all to the good. Others are horrified by it, the idea that parents would outsource some of these functions and pay for them. What's your reaction?
Well, I mean, some of those examples are extreme, and then they become like silly almost, the extent to which. But I think that there is a central issue that as more women are in the workplace and as the population ages, we do have a growing problem of who does the care for children and who does the care for the elderly and who does the care for the sick, right? Which has been not traditionally, but for some social classes and some segments of history, women's jobs. One of the arguments that the book makes is against the concern that if you have paid carers, be it nanny or nurses, that are paid to do some of the caring, again, we should not assume that paid care depletes love. And we should not assume that no pay, that when this work is done by kin, it's necessarily guaranteeing good care. So that again, and one of the main concerns in this area is that because we have these hostile worldview about paid care, this sense that it has to be better if it's done without pay, it leads to underpayment of carers, to lack of recognition of paid carers, and in fact compounds the problem. So again, here, if we stop worrying about mixing, in this case, the intimacy of caring for kids or the elderly or the sick, if we stop worrying about mixing it with economic activity, again, we should start worrying about how do we achieve the right mix. How should we pay and how, in what ways should we treat this paid care that would enhance everybody's welfare? The people who are cared for and the people who are doing the care, because at this time, in most places, it's quite disgraceful. And not all because people are concerned about the mixing. There are many other issues going on. But the goal of equitable mixes is, if I want to leave a message again, is don't worry about the mixing. Worry about right mixes of economic with intimacy in all these domains.
Well, that's a good place to end. Thank you for a very fascinating hour. My guest today has been Viviana Zelizer, the Lloyd Kotzen Professor of Sociology at Princeton University. We've been talking about her book and her ideas. Her latest book is The Purchase of Intimacy from Princeton University Press. Viviana, thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.